The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows across the picturesque town of Whitefish, Montana. Nestled in the heart of the Flathead Valley, Whitefish had long been known for its stunning natural beauty, world-class ski resort, and tight-knit community. But on this particular evening, an incident would occur that would shake the town to its core, forcing its residents to confront long-held prejudices and question the very identity of their community. At the center of this unfolding drama was the Golden Fork, an upscale restaurant that had been a fixture in Whitefish for over 3 decades. Owned and operated by Gerald Hawkins, a third-generation Montanan with deep roots in the community, the Golden Fork was more than just a dining establishment. It was a symbol of Whitefish's growth from a sleepy railroad town to a sought-after tourist destination. Gerald Hawkins, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual scowl, took great pride in his restaurant. He had inherited the business from his father and had spent years cultivating a reputation for serving the finest locally sourced ingredients prepared with a distinctly Montana flair. The Golden Fork was where the town's elite gathered, where important business deals were struck, and where tourists came to get a taste of authentic Montana cuisine. As the dinner rush began on this fateful Friday evening, the Golden Fork hummed with activity. The soft clink of silverware against china mingled with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. The warm glow of Edison bulbs cast a flattering light over the rustic chic decor, all reclaimed wood and wrought iron, a carefully curated vision of Montana living. Emily Carter, the 22-year-old hostess, stood at her podium near the entrance, a practiced smile on her face as she greeted the steady stream of guests. Emily, a local girl working her way through college, had always seen the Golden Fork as a stepping stone, a good job that paid well and looked impressive on a resume. But lately, she had begun to feel a growing unease about some of the attitudes she encountered at work, particularly from her boss. As Emily seated a pair of regulars, Bob and Linda Thompson, fixtures of the Whitefish social scene, she caught sight of a sleek black SUV pulling into the parking lot. The vehicle's out-of-state plates immediately piqued her interest. Whitefish had seen an influx of wealthy out-of-towners in recent years, drawn by the natural beauty and the growing reputation of the town as an outdoor enthusiast's paradise. But something about this car, with its tinted windows and polished exterior, suggested its occupants were more than just typical tourists. The SUV's doors opened, and Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Stepping out of the driver's side was a tall, distinguished-looking black man in his mid-40s. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that accentuated his athletic build, and his confident bearing spoke of success and authority. From the passenger side emerged an equally striking woman, perhaps a few years younger, with flawless dark skin and natural hair styled in an elegant updo. Her emerald green dress hugged her curves, and she carried herself with the poise of a runway model. As the couple made their way towards the entrance, Emily could feel the eyes of the other patrons following them. Whitefish, for all its recent growth and popularity, was still a predominantly white town. The arrival of an affluent black couple at its most exclusive restaurant was bound to turn heads. Emily straightened her posture and broadened her smile as the couple approached. "Good evening," she said warmly. "Welcome to the Golden Fork. Do you have a reservation?" The man returned her smile, his voice deep and melodious as he replied, "Yes, we do. It should be under Johnson, Marcus and Olivia Johnson." Emily quickly found their name in the reservation book and nodded. "Of course, Dr. and Mrs. Johnson. Your table is ready, if you'll follow me, please." As Emily led the Johnsons through the restaurant, she could hear the whispers starting, feel the stares of the other diners. She did her best to ignore it, focusing instead on her task. "Here we are," she said, gesturing to a table near the center of the dining room. "Your server will be with you shortly. Enjoy your meal." Marcus pulled out a chair for Olivia before seating himself. They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the attention they were receiving. It wasn't anything new to them. As successful professionals in predominantly white fields, they were used to being the only black people in many spaces. But there was something about the atmosphere in the Golden Fork, that felt different, more charged somehow. As Emily made her way back to her podium, she passed by the kitchen, where she overheard a heated conversation between Gerald Hawkins and Jake Peterson, one of the waiters. "I'm not serving them," Jake was saying, his voice low but intense. "You know how I feel about those people." Emily felt her stomach churn at Jake's words. She had always known he harbored racist views, but hearing him express them so openly was still shocking. Gerald's response was equally disturbing. "I don't like it any more than you do, Jake. But we can't just refuse to serve them. It's not like the old days. We've got to be careful." Emily hurried past, not wanting to hear any more. She felt a mix of emotions: disgust at Jake and Gerald's attitudes, shame at her own inaction, and a growing sense of dread about how the evening might unfold. Back at their table, Marcus and Olivia were perusing the menu, their heads bent close together as they discussed their options. Despite the less than welcoming atmosphere, they were determined to enjoy their evening. They had heard great things about the Golden Fork and had been looking forward to trying it during their weekend getaway in Whitefish. Marcus Johnson was a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, known for pioneering a revolutionary minimally invasive technique that had saved countless lives. He had grown up in inner-city Chicago, the son of a single mother who had worked multiple jobs to ensure he got the best education possible. His journey from the South Side to the operating theaters of the nation's top hospitals had been marked by determination, brilliance, and an unwavering belief in his own abilities. Olivia Johnson, née Taylor, was equally accomplished in her own right. A best-selling author and civil rights activist, she had made a name for herself, writing powerful, thought-provoking novels that explored the complexities of race relations in America. Raised in a middle-class family in Atlanta, Olivia had been steeped in the history and legacy of the civil rights movement from a young age. Her words had the power to move, to challenge, and to inspire change. The Johnsons had met at a charity gala in New York City 5 years ago and had fallen deeply in love. They were a power couple in every sense of the word, using their platforms and resources to advocate for social justice and equality. Their weekend trip to Montana was a rare break from their hectic lives, a chance to reconnect with each other and enjoy some peace and quiet. As they debated between the elk tenderloin and the cedar plank salmon, they were unaware of the storm brewing in the kitchen. Jake had flat out refused to serve them, and Gerald was growing increasingly agitated. The other wait staff were exchanging worried glances, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, Gerald made a decision. He would handle this table himself. He couldn't risk any of his staff causing a scene or treating these customers poorly. At least if he did it himself, he could control the situation. Straightening his tie and plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, Gerald approached the Johnsons' table. "Good evening," he said, his voice overly cheerful. "I'm Gerald Hawkins, the owner of the Golden Fork. I'll be taking care of you this evening. Have you had a chance to look at our menu?" Marcus looked up, slightly surprised to be served by the owner himself. "Yes, we have," he replied. "Everything looks delicious. We're having a hard time deciding, actually." Gerald nodded, his smile still fixed in place. "Well, our elk tenderloin is a house specialty, locally sourced, of course, and the huckleberry sauce is made from berries picked right here in the Flathead Valley." As Gerald described the various dishes, his tone professional but lacking any real warmth, Olivia studied him closely. As a writer, she had developed a keen eye for reading people, and something about Gerald's demeanor set off alarm bells in her mind. There was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of discomfort or perhaps even hostility. After taking their orders, the elk for Marcus, the salmon for Olivia, Gerald retreated to the kitchen, leaving the couple to sip their wine and take in the ambiance of the restaurant. "Did you notice anything off about him?" Olivia asked Marcus in a low voice. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did. He seemed, I don't know, uncomfortable, like he didn't really want to be serving us." Olivia sighed. "I was afraid of that. I've been feeling eyes on us since we walked in. I was hoping it was just my imagination, but..." Marcus reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "Hey, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe he's just having a bad day. Let's try to enjoy our meal. Okay?" Olivia nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As a black woman in America, she had developed a sixth sense for detecting racial hostility, no matter how subtly it manifested. And right now, that sense was on high alert. In the kitchen, Gerald was barking orders at his staff, his face flushed with barely contained anger. "I want those meals perfect, you hear me? Not a single thing out of place. We can't give them any reason to complain." The kitchen staff exchanged worried glances. They had never seen Gerald this agitated before. It was clear that the presence of the Johnsons in his restaurant had rattled him deeply. As the evening progressed, the tension in the Golden Fork continued to build. Other diners kept stealing glances at the Johnsons, some out of simple curiosity, others with less benign intentions. The whispers grew louder, fueled by wine and long-held prejudices. At a nearby table, Bob Thompson leaned in close to his wife Linda. "Can you believe it?" he muttered. "In all my years coming here, I've never seen Gerald serve a table himself, and for them, of all people." Linda shushed him, but her eyes kept darting over to the Johnsons' table. "They look so out of place," she whispered back. "I wonder what they're doing in Whitefish anyway." Similar conversations were happening throughout the restaurant, a low undercurrent of discomfort and resentment building with each passing moment. The Johnsons, acutely aware of the attention they were receiving, did their best to ignore it, focusing instead on each other and their meal. As Gerald brought out their entrees, his forced smile was beginning to crack. The stress of the situation, combined with his own deeply ingrained prejudices, was wearing away at his self-control. He set the plates down with a little more force than necessary, sloshing some of the sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Olivia said, reaching for her napkin to dab at the spill. Gerald's reaction was immediate and disproportionate. "Don't touch that," he snapped. "I'll have someone clean it up properly." The Johnsons froze, shocked by the sudden outburst. The restaurant fell silent, all eyes now openly fixed on their table. Marcus was the first to recover. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel, "is there a problem here?" Gerald seemed to realize he had crossed a line. He took a deep breath, visibly struggling to regain his composure. "No problem at all. I apologize for my outburst. Please enjoy your meal." But as he turned to walk away, Gerald muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the Johnsons to hear, "Should have known this would happen if we let them in." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Olivia felt as if she had been physically struck, the blatant racism of Gerald's comment leaving her momentarily breathless. Marcus's hand tightened around his fork, his knuckles turning white with the effort of controlling his anger. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over them, heavy and suffocating. Around them, the other diners pretended to return to their meals, but the tension in the room was palpable. Finally, Olivia found her voice. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think we should leave." Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "You're right, we don't have to subject ourselves to this." As they stood to leave, Gerald emerged from the kitchen, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded. "You haven't paid for your meal." Marcus turned to face him, drawing himself up to his full height. At 6'2", he towered over Gerald. "Mr. Hawkins," he said, his voice low and controlled, "we came here for a pleasant dinner, not to be subjected to racist treatment. We will not be paying for this experience." Gerald's face flushed an even deeper shade of red. "Now you listen here," he sputtered. "You can't just walk out of here without paying. That's theft." By now, the entire restaurant was watching the confrontation unfold. Emily, the hostess, stood frozen at her podium, torn between her job responsibilities and her growing horror at her boss's behavior. Olivia stepped forward, her eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and determination. "Mr. Hawkins, what you've done here tonight is far worse than not receiving payment for a meal. You've shown us and everyone in this restaurant the ugliness of racism. You've made it clear that in your eyes we are not welcome here because of the color of our skin." Her words seemed to penetrate the fog of anger surrounding Gerald. For a moment, he looked taken aback, perhaps realizing for the first time how his actions might be perceived. But then his expression hardened again. "This is my restaurant," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. I have the right to refuse service to anyone. I want you out of here now, and don't you dare come back." The Johnsons didn't need to be told twice. With dignity, they gathered their belongings and made their way towards the exit. As they passed by the other tables, they could see a range of emotions on the faces of the other diners: shame, shock, and in some cases, poorly disguised approval of Gerald's actions. Just as they reached the door, a voice called out, "Wait!" They turned to see Emily hurrying towards them, her face pale but determined. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "What happened to you was wrong. I should have said something sooner." Olivia gave her a small, sad smile. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot to hear that." As the Johnsons left the Golden Fork, the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in. They had come to Whitefish looking for a peaceful getaway, and instead had been confronted with the ugly face of racism in a place they least expected it. Back inside the restaurant, chaos erupted. Some patrons were loudly expressing their disgust at Gerald's behavior, while others defended him, arguing that he had the right to run his business as he saw fit. Emily found herself in the middle of it all, like trying to calm people down while fighting back her own tears of frustration and shame. Gerald retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him. He paced back and forth, alternating between rage at the Johnsons for causing a scene in his restaurant and a creeping sense of dread as he began to realize the potential consequences of his actions. As word of the incident spread through the small town of Whitefish, it was like a match had been struck in a powder keg. Long simmering tensions and unspoken prejudices suddenly burst into the open, forcing the community to confront some uncomfortable truths about itself. The Johnsons, meanwhile, returned to their hotel room, both physically and emotionally exhausted. As they sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what had happened, Olivia's phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had posted about the incident on social media, and the story was already starting to go viral. Marcus ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than his 45 years. "What do we do now, Liv?" he asked. Olivia was quiet for a moment, her mind racing. Then, with a determined set to her jaw, she said, "We fight back. We make sure this story is heard. We use our platforms to shed light on what happened here tonight. Not just for us, but for all the people who face this kind of discrimination every day and don't have the means to speak out." Marcus nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth despite the circumstances. This was the Olivia he had fallen in love with. Passionate, determined, always ready to stand up for what was right. "Okay," he said, reaching for her hand. "Let's do it. Where do we start?" Olivia was already reaching for her laptop. "First, we document everything while it's fresh in our minds. Then we reach out to some contacts, media, civil rights organizations, legal experts. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about making sure that what happened tonight never happens to anyone else in this town again." As the Johnsons began their work, the town of Whitefish was erupting into a frenzy of activity. News of the incident at the Golden Fork spread like wildfire, fueled by social media and small-town gossip networks. Sarah Thompson, a 35-year-old reporter for the local newspaper, the Whitefish Gazette, had been enjoying a quiet dinner with her husband when she overheard the commotion at the Johnsons' table. Her journalistic instincts immediately kicked in, and she spent the rest of the evening gathering statements from witnesses and trying to piece together what had happened. Now, back at her small home office, Sarah was furiously typing up her article, knowing that this could be the biggest story of her career. She had always suspected that beneath Whitefish's friendly, welcoming exterior lurked some darker truths, but she had never had concrete evidence until now. As she wrote, Sarah's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from friends and neighbors, all asking if she had heard about what happened at the Golden Fork. It seemed that everyone in town had an opinion on the matter, and the community was quickly dividing into factions. Across town, in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of Whitefish, Jake Peterson, the waiter who had refused to serve the Johnsons, sat in his darkened living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table in front of him. His girlfriend, Lisa, watched him with growing concern. "Jake," she said softly, "maybe you should slow down. We don't know what's going to happen yet." Jake looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot. "Don't you get it, Lisa? It's over. Once this gets out, I'll never work in this town again. Hell, I'll be lucky if I don't end up in jail." Lisa sat down next to him, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You made a mistake, Jake, a big one. But maybe this is a wake-up call. Maybe it's time to really examine why you feel the way you do about people who are different from us." Jake snorted derisively. "Different? They're the ones who came here to our town, acting like they own the place. Why couldn't they just stay in their own neighborhoods?" Lisa recoiled slightly at the venom in his voice. She had always known Jake harbored some prejudiced views, but hearing him express them so openly was shocking. For the first time, she found herself questioning their relationship and the future they had planned together. Meanwhile, at the Whitefish police station, Chief Robert Larson was working late, trying to get ahead of what he knew would be a major crisis for the community. He had already received dozens of calls about the incident at the Golden Fork, and he knew that by morning, the national media would likely be descending on their small town. Chief Larson was a fair-minded man who had always prided himself on treating everyone equally under the law. But he was also a pragmatist who understood the complex dynamics of the community he served. He knew that handling this situation would require a delicate balance between upholding the law and maintaining peace in the town. As he reviewed the preliminary reports, Chief Larson's phone rang. It was the mayor, sounding panicked. "Bob, tell me you're on top of this Golden Fork situation," Mayor Williams said without preamble. "I'm doing my best, John," Chief Larson replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. "But this is a complicated situation. We're going to need to tread carefully." "Carefully? Bob, we need to shut this down now before it gets any bigger. Do you have any idea what this could do to our tourism industry? To our reputation?" Chief Larson felt a flare of irritation at the mayor's words. "With all due respect, John, I think we need to be more concerned about doing what's right than about our reputation. If what I'm hearing is true, a serious crime was committed tonight. We can't just sweep that under the rug." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Mayor Williams spoke again, his voice was cold. "Just remember, Bob, we all have a stake in keeping Whitefish the way it is. Don't do anything rash." As the call ended, Chief Larson sat back in his chair, a feeling of unease settling in his stomach. He had always known that there were powerful people in town who preferred to maintain the status quo, but he had never felt it so explicitly stated before. For the first time in his long career, he found himself questioning where his true loyalties should lie. Back at the Golden Fork, Gerald Hawkins had finally emerged from his office. The restaurant was empty now, the last of the shocked diners having left long ago. The staff stood around in small groups, whispering among themselves and falling silent whenever Gerald approached. Emily, the hostess, was gathering her things, preparing to leave. As she headed for the door, Gerald called out to her, "Emily, wait, I need to talk to you." She turned slowly, her face a mask of barely contained anger and disappointment. "Yes, Mr. Hawkins?" Gerald cleared his throat uncomfortably. "About what happened earlier. I need you to understand, I was just trying to protect our establishment, our way of life. You know how things are changing around here, with all these out-of-towners moving in. We need to stand our ground." Emily stared at him in disbelief. "Stand our ground? Mr. Hawkins, what you did tonight was wrong. It was illegal, and it was cruel. Those people did nothing to deserve the way you treated them." Gerald's face hardened. "Now you listen here, young lady. I've known you since you were a little girl. I gave you this job when no one else would hire you. You don't get to lecture me about right and wrong." Emily felt a surge of courage she didn't know she possessed. "No, Mr. Hawkins, you listen. I've looked up to you for years. I defended you when people said you were stuck in the past. But after tonight, I can't do that anymore. What you did was racist, plain and simple. And I won't be a part of it anymore. I quit." With that, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving a stunned Gerald in her wake. As the door closed behind her, Emily felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew she had just burned an important bridge, but she also felt, for the first time in a long time, that she had stood up for what was right. As the night wore on, the various players in this unfolding drama tried to get what rest they could, all aware that the morning would bring new challenges and that nothing in their small town would ever be quite the same again. The Johnsons, having spent hours documenting their experience and reaching out to contacts, finally fell into a fitful sleep, holding each other close for comfort. Sarah Thompson put the finishing touches on her article, knowing it would send shockwaves through the community. Chief Larson tossed and turned, weighing his duties as a law enforcement officer against the political pressures he faced. Jake Peterson finally passed out on his couch, his girlfriend Lisa lying awake beside him, questioning everything she thought she knew about the man she loved. And Gerald Hawkins sat alone in his darkened restaurant, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring at the table where the Johnsons had sat. He replayed the events of the evening over and over in his mind, trying to justify his actions to himself. But with each passing hour, the weight of what he had done pressed down on him more heavily, and the future he had always taken for granted began to crumble before his eyes. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, casting long shadows across the sleeping town of Whitefish, none of its residents could have predicted the storm that was about to break over their community, forcing them to confront long-held beliefs and changing their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Whitefish began to stir with an unusual energy. The events of the previous night at the Golden Fork had spread through the town like wildfire, and it seemed everyone had an opinion to share or a side to take. At the Johnsons' hotel, Marcus and Olivia woke early, their sleep having been fitful and plagued by the lingering emotions of their experience. As Olivia checked her phone, she was taken aback by the flood of notifications. Their social media posts about the incident had gone viral overnight, shared thousands of times, and picked up by several national news outlets. "Marcus," she called, her voice a mix of surprise and determination. "I think we need to be prepared for a lot of attention today. This is bigger than we anticipated." Marcus nodded grimly as he scrolled through his own phone. "I've got missed calls from the NCP, the ACLU, and 3 different news networks. Liv, are we ready for this?" Olivia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "We have to be. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about every person of color who's ever felt unwelcome or discriminated against. We have a platform, and we need to use it." As the Johnsons prepared to face the day, across town, Sarah Thompson was already at her desk in the Whitefish Gazette office. She had been there since before dawn, putting the finishing touches on her article and preparing for the inevitable fallout. Her editor, a grizzled veteran journalist named Frank Miller, leaned against her desk, reading over the final draft, his brow furrowed deeper with each paragraph. "Sarah," he said finally, "this is dynamite. Are you sure about every detail? We can't afford any mistakes on this one." Sarah nodded confidently. "I've triple-checked everything, Frank. I've got multiple witness statements, and I've reached out to all parties involved for comment. This is solid." Frank sighed heavily. "All right then, let's run it. But be prepared for a storm. This is going to ruffle a lot of feathers in this town." As the presses began to roll, printing thousands of copies of Sarah's explosive article, the town of Whitefish continued to wake up to the new reality that had dawned upon them. At the police station, Chief Robert Larson arrived early, knowing he had a long day ahead of him. He had barely settled into his office when there was a knock at the door. It was Mayor John Williams, looking harried and sleep-deprived. "Bob?" the mayor said without preamble, "We need to get control of this situation now." Chief Larson leaned back in his chair, studying the mayor carefully. "And how do you propose we do that, John? A crime may have been committed. We can't just ignore that." Mayor Williams paced the small office, agitation clear in every movement. "A crime? Come on, Bob. Gerald Hawkins is a pillar of this community. He employs dozens of people. His restaurant brings in tourists from all over the country. We can't just throw him to the wolves because of one misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Chief Larson repeated, his voice sharp. "John, if what I've heard is true, this was a clear case of racial discrimination. That's not a misunderstanding. It's a violation of federal law." The mayor stopped pacing, turning to face the chief with a hard look in his eyes. "Listen to me, Bob. This town is on the brink of something big. We've got developers interested in building a new resort. We're finally starting to compete with Aspen and Vale. We can't afford a scandal like this. You need to find a way to make this go away." Chief Larson felt a chill run down his spine at the mayor's words. He had always known that there were powerful interests at play in Whitefish, but he had never felt their influence so directly before. For a moment, he was tempted to give in, to find some way to sweep this under the rug. But then he thought of his own daughter, of the values he had tried to instill in her, and he knew he couldn't compromise his integrity. "I'm sorry, John," he said, his voice firm, "but I took an oath to uphold the law, not to protect the town's image. I intend to investigate this incident fully and fairly, no matter where it leads." The mayor's face flushed with anger. "You're making a big mistake, Bob. You have no idea who you're going up against." As Mayor Williams stormed out of the office, Chief Larson sat back in his chair, a mixture of determination and apprehension settling over him. He knew he had just made a powerful enemy, but he also felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was doing the right thing. Meanwhile, at the Golden Fork, Gerald Hawkins arrived to find a small crowd gathered outside. Some held signs condemning racism, while others showed support for the embattled restaurant owner. As Gerald pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions and accusations, he was struck by how quickly his world had changed. Inside, the restaurant was eerily quiet. Half of his staff hadn't shown up for work, including Emily, the hostess who had quit the night before. Those who had come in moved about silently, avoiding Gerald's gaze. As Gerald made his way to his office, he was stopped by his son, Michael. The 24-year-old had driven through the night from his college in Missoula after hearing about the incident. "Dad," Michael said, his voice a mixture of disappointment and concern. "What were you thinking?" Gerald felt a flash of anger at his son's tone. "I was thinking about protecting our business, our way of life. You wouldn't understand. You've been away too long, filled with all those liberal college ideas." Michael shook his head sadly. "No, Dad, this isn't about liberal or conservative. This is about basic human decency. What you did was wrong, and you know it." As father and son stared at each other, the gulf between them seeming to widen with each passing moment, the door to the restaurant burst open. A group of reporters rushed in, cameras flashing and questions flying. "Mr. Hawkins, can you comment on the allegations of racial discrimination? Is it true that you physically threatened the Johnsons? Are you aware that your actions may have violated federal law?" Gerald stood frozen, overwhelmed by the onslaught. For the first time, the full weight of what he had done began to settle on him. As he looked from the angry faces of the reporters to the disappointed face of his son, Gerald Hawkins realized that his life and the life of his entire community would never be the same again. As the morning wore on, the tension in Whitefish continued to build. The Whitefish Gazette hit the stands. Sarah Thompson's article splashed across the front page in bold type. "Racial incident at local restaurant sparks outrage." The story laid out the events of the previous night in stark detail, including quotes from witnesses and a statement from the Johnsons. The reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours, the Gazette's office was flooded with calls and emails. Some praised Sarah for her brave reporting, while others accused her of sensationalism and trying to stir up trouble. At the local diner, Molly's Place, the usual morning crowd was abuzz with discussion. The diner's owner, Molly Henderson, a 60-year-old woman who had lived in Whitefish her entire life, found herself in the uncomfortable position of mediating heated debates between her customers. "I just don't see what the big deal is," grumbled Earl Watson, a retired logger. "Gerald's got the right to serve who he wants in his own restaurant." "That's not how the law works, Earl," countered Lisa Chen, a young lawyer who had moved to Whitefish a few years ago. "Racial discrimination in public accommodations is illegal. Period." As the argument grew more heated, Molly stepped in. Now, she said, her voice firm but kind. "We're all neighbors here. Instead of fighting, maybe we should be thinking about how we can do better, how we can make sure something like this doesn't happen again." Her words seemed to have a calming effect on the crowd. But Molly couldn't shake the feeling that this incident had exposed deep divisions in her beloved town that wouldn't be easily healed. Meanwhile, at the local high school, the incident was the talk of the hallways. Students gathered in groups, discussing what had happened and sharing their own experiences with racism in the town. Jamal Washington, one of the few black students in the predominantly white school, found himself at the center of much of the discussion. "It's not like this is the first time something like this has happened," he told his friends during lunch. "It's just the first time it's gotten this much attention." His words were overheard by Mr. Thompson, the American history teacher, who had been grappling with how to address the incident in his classes. "Jamal," he said, approaching the table, "would you be willing to share some of your experiences with the class? I think it could be really valuable for everyone to hear your perspective." Jamal hesitated, feeling the weight of his classmates' eyes on him. But then he thought of the bite. Jamal thought of the Johnsons, of their courage in speaking out, and he nodded slowly. "Yeah, Mr. Thompson, I think I can do that." As the school day progressed, many teachers found themselves abandoning their planned lessons to discuss the incident at the Golden Fork. It was a challenging day for educators, trying to navigate the complex issues of race and discrimination while maintaining a respectful and productive dialogue. Back at their hotel, Marcus and Olivia Johnson were preparing for a press conference. They had spent the morning fielding calls from reporters, civil rights organizations, and even a few Hollywood producers interested in their story. Olivia's publisher had called, eager to discuss the possibility of a book about their experience. As Marcus adjusted his tie, he caught Olivia's eye in the mirror. "Are you sure about this, Liv? Once we do this press conference, there's no going back. Our lives will never be the same." Olivia stepped up behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "I'm sure. We have a responsibility to use our voices, to shine a light on what happened here. It's not just about us anymore." Marcus nodded, covering one of her hands with his own. "You're right. Let's do this." As they made their way to the hotel conference room, they were struck by the number of people gathered. Reporters from local and national news outlets jostled for position, cameras at the ready. At the back of the room, they spotted Sarah Thompson from the Whitefish Gazette, notepad in hand. The room fell silent as Marcus and Olivia took their places behind the podium. Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak, his deep voice steady and controlled. "Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Marcus Johnson, and this is my wife Olivia. We came to Whitefish for a quiet weekend getaway. Instead, we found ourselves face to face with the ugly reality of racism that still persists in our country." As Marcus recounted the events at the Golden Fork, Olivia watched the reporters' reactions. She saw shock, sympathy, and in some cases, skepticism flash across their faces. When Marcus finished, she stepped up to the microphone. "What happened to us is not unique," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Every day, people of color face discrimination, big and small. Most of the time, these incidents go unreported, unnoticed by the wider world. But we have a platform, and we intend to use it. We're not here to vilify the town of Whitefish or its people. We're here to start a conversation, to challenge people, to examine their own biases, and to do better." As Olivia spoke, her words were being broadcast live across the country. In living rooms, offices, and bars across America, people stopped to listen. In Whitefish, the town seemed to hold its collective breath. At the Golden Fork, Gerald Hawkins watched the press conference on a small TV in his office, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to lash out, to defend himself and his actions. But another part, a part he had long tried to ignore, felt a deep sense of shame. As the Johnsons opened the floor for questions, the reporters surged forward, each trying to get their query in. Sarah Thompson managed to catch Marcus's eye. "Dr. Johnson," she called out. "Sarah Thompson from the Whitefish Gazette. Can you tell us what you hope will come out of this incident?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. "What we hope for, Miss Thompson, is change. Not just here in Whitefish, but across the country. We hope that our experience will spark conversations, will make people think twice before acting on their prejudices. We hope it will encourage others who have faced discrimination to speak out. And most of all, we hope it will lead to real, lasting change in how we treat each other as human beings." As the press conference continued, the impact of the Johnsons' words was already being felt across Whitefish. At the police station, Chief Larson watched the broadcast with a growing sense of resolve. He knew that handling this case right could be a defining moment for his department and for the town. In the mayor's office, John Williams watched with a growing sense of dread. He could already imagine the damage this would do to the town's reputation, to the tourism industry they had worked so hard to build. He reached for his phone, ready to call in every favor he had to try and contain this situation. At Whitefish High School, Jamal Washington sat in Mr. Thompson's history class, watching the press conference on the classroom smartboard. As he listened to Marcus and Olivia Johnson articulate the reality he had lived with his entire life, he felt a mixture of validation and hope. For the first time, he felt like his experiences were being acknowledged on a national stage. Meanwhile, at a small coffee shop downtown, Emily, the former hostess from the Golden Fork, sat with a group of her co-workers who had also quit in protest. They watched the press conference on someone's laptop, occasionally nodding in agreement with the Johnsons' words. "We did the right thing," Emily said, looking around at her friends. "I know it was scary to quit, but we couldn't keep working there after what happened." Jake Peterson, the waiter who had refused to serve the Johnsons, was noticeably absent from the group. He was at home, ignoring the incessant ringing of his phone as reporters tried to get a statement from him. He sat on his couch, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table, wrestling with the consequences of his actions and the beliefs that had led him to this point. As the press conference wound down, Marcus and Olivia thanked the reporters and made their way back to their hotel room. As soon as the door closed behind them, Olivia let out a long breath, the tension of the past 24 hours finally catching up with her. Marcus pulled her into a tight embrace. "You are amazing out there," he murmured into her hair. Olivia leaned into him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "We both were. But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, it is. But we're in this together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it as a team." As they stood there holding each other, they were unaware of the forces their words had set in motion. Across Whitefish, across Montana, and indeed across the country, people were talking, debating, soul-searching. The incident at the Golden Fork had become a flashpoint, a catalyst for a larger conversation about race in America. In the days that followed, Whitefish found itself under an unprecedented spotlight. National news crews descended on the small town, their satellite trucks clogging the picturesque streets. Protesters and counter-protesters arrived, their competing chants echoing through the mountain air. The Golden Fork remained closed, its windows papered over, a lone, "closed for renovation" sign hanging crookedly on the door. Gerald Hawkins had gone to ground, refusing all requests for interviews and ignoring the increasingly frantic calls from his lawyer. At the police station, Chief Larson was working around the clock, coordinating with state and federal authorities. The incident had officially become a civil rights investigation, with the FBI sending a team to assist local law enforcement. Mayor Williams was in full damage control mode, holding daily press conferences to assure the world that Whitefish was a welcoming, inclusive community. But his words rang hollow to many, especially as more stories of discrimination began to surface. Inspired by the Johnsons' bravery, other residents of Whitefish, both current and former, began to speak out about their own experiences with racism in the town. Jamal Washington's classroom speech had turned into a viral video, prompting a broader conversation about the experiences of minority students in predominantly white schools. Sarah Thompson's reporting continued to drive the conversation. She dug deeper into the town's history, uncovering a pattern of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination that had gone unchallenged for years. Her articles were being picked up by national publications, bringing even more attention to Whitefish. For Marcus and Olivia Johnson, the days blurred together in a whirlwind of interviews, meetings with civil rights leaders, and strategy sessions with their newly hired legal team. They had decided to file a lawsuit against the Golden Fork and Gerald Hawkins, not for monetary gain, but to set a legal precedent and to force a public reckoning. As the week wore on, the temperature of the debate began to rise. Online forums and social media were flooded with arguments both for and against the Johnsons. The couple received messages of support from around the world, but also faced a barrage of hateful comments and even death threats, necessitating increased security at their hotel. In Whitefish, the community continued to grapple with the fallout. The incident had forced many to confront uncomfortable truths about their town and themselves. Long-standing friendships were strained as people found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. Family dinners became battlegrounds of competing ideologies. At Molly's place, the diner had become a de facto town hall, with Molly herself often mediating heated discussions between her customers. She had taken to posting articles about the history of civil rights on the diner's walls, gently encouraging her patrons to educate themselves. "I've lived in this town my whole life," she told a reporter from the local news, "and I love it here. But loving something doesn't mean ignoring its flaws. We've got some work to do, and it's about time we faced up to it." Her words seemed to resonate with many in the community. Slowly, alongside the anger and defensiveness, a current of reflection and a desire for change began to emerge. At Whitefish High School, Principal Karen Lewis had organized a series of assemblies and workshops on diversity and inclusion. The school board, after a contentious meeting that lasted well into the night, voted to revise the curriculum to include more diverse perspectives in history and literature classes. Even some of those who had initially defended Gerald Hawkins began to reconsider their positions. Bob Thompson, who had been a regular at the Golden Fork for years, found himself in a heated argument with his wife Linda. "I've known Gerald for 30 years, Bob insisted. "He's not a bad guy. He just made a mistake." Linda shook her head, her expression sad but determined. "Bob, honey, sometimes good people can do bad things, and when they do, they need to be held accountable. What Gerald did was wrong, and we can't just pretend it didn't happen because he's our friend." As the debate raged on, Marcus and Olivia Johnson found themselves at the center of a movement they had never anticipated. What had started as a simple dinner out had turned into a national conversation about race, privilege, and the work still to be done in America's journey towards true equality. 1 week after the incident, the Johnsons stood on the steps of Whitefish City Hall, surrounded by a diverse group of supporters. They were there to announce the creation of the Whitefish Equality Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting diversity and combating discrimination in small towns across America. As Olivia stepped up to the microphone, she looked out at the sea of faces before her. She saw hope, determination, and a genuine desire for change. In that moment, despite all the turmoil of the past week, she felt a surge of optimism. "What happened to us in Whitefish was painful," she began, her voice carrying across the crowd. "But out of that pain, we have seen something beautiful emerge. We've seen a community willing to look at itself honestly, to acknowledge its flaws, and to work towards becoming better. That's not an easy thing to do. It's much easier to become defensive, to deny that a problem exists. But the people of Whitefish have chosen the harder path, the path of growth and change." As Olivia spoke, her words were being broadcast live across the country. In living rooms and offices, in schools and community centers, people listened, moved by her message of hope and reconciliation. "This is not the end of our journey," Olivia continued. "It's just the beginning. The work of creating true equality, of building a society where everyone is treated with dignity and respect regardless of the color of their skin, is ongoing. It requires constant vigilance, constant self-reflection, and a willingness to have difficult conversations. But I believe we're up to the challenge. I believe that what has started here in Whitefish can spread across our nation, igniting a movement of understanding and positive change." As Olivia finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause. Marcus stepped up to join her, taking her hand in his. Together, they stood as a symbol of resilience, of the power of speaking truth to injustice, and of the possibility of transformation. In the weeks and months that followed, Whitefish underwent a profound change. The Golden Fork eventually reopened under new management, with a commitment to diversity in its hiring practices, and a portion of its profits going to civil rights organizations. Gerald Hawkins, after a period of reflection, issued a public apology, and began working with the Whitefish Equality Initiative to educate others about the dangers of unchecked bias. The lawsuit filed by the Johnsons was settled out of court, with the terms including mandatory diversity training for all businesses in Whitefish and the establishment of a scholarship fund for minority students. Sarah Thompson's reporting on the incident and its aftermath won her a Pulitzer Prize, bringing national attention to the importance of local journalism in promoting social justice. Jamal Washington, inspired by the events, became a leading voice for change in his school and community. He went on to study law, determined to follow in the footsteps of civil rights leaders who had come before him. And Marcus and Olivia Johnson, though they returned to their lives in Seattle, remained closely connected to Whitefish. They made frequent visits to the town, speaking at schools and community events, always pushing for progress while acknowledging the strides that had been made. The incident at the Golden Fork had indeed changed Whitefish forever. But out of that change had come growth, understanding, and a renewed commitment to creating a truly inclusive community. It wasn't always easy, and there were still challenges to be faced, but the town had taken its first steps on a new path, a path towards a more just and equitable future. As the sun set over the mountains on another day in Whitefish, casting a golden glow over the town, there was a sense of hope in the air. A sense that, despite the long road ahead, this small town in Montana had shown that change was possible, that hearts and minds could be opened, and that the arc of history could indeed bend towards justice.